I'm Julia, 50 years old. I live peacefully with my husband, Rich. However, up until a few years ago, every day felt like a storm. My mother-in-law, who lived alone, became bedridden about 10 years ago. She tripped over a small step at the front door and fractured her pelvis, forcing her into the hospital. She underwent 2 surgeries, and her hospital stay lasted a long time. Her lower body muscles weakened, and she was reluctant to go to physical therapy. Nurses and physical therapists would call me every day, desperate for help. Even when Rich or I tried to convince her, she stubbornly refused to get out of bed.
You'd understand if you were in my shoes. Do you know how hard it is when your body won't do what you want it to?
My mother-in-law often got frustrated with her body not doing what she wanted, and she'd take it out on everyone around her. Hearing her yell from her hospital room was not an uncommon occurrence. I knew it was pointless for me to say anything, so I asked Rich to patiently convince her, but he gave up pretty quickly on his stubborn mother.
If she really doesn't want to do it, then she doesn't have to.
Both my mother-in-law and Rich are stubborn, so once it gets like this, there's no way to resolve it. Even when the doctor told her that she'd end up almost completely bedridden, she seemed completely unfazed, as if she'd already given up. On top of that, she even said she wanted to move in with us if she became bedridden. Actually, my mother-in-law isn't biologically related to Rich. She was the second wife of his father, and after his father passed away, she lived with her stepson, Rich. Her objective in marrying Rich's father was to acquire his wealth. However, she didn't get along with him, and she held a grudge about the inheritance not going smoothly. I married into that family and lived separately from her. Even though it was caregiving, I wanted to avoid living with such a high-strung and selfish mother-in-law at all costs. I patiently tried to convince her to do physical therapy, but nothing changed. When I made one last suggestion that she transfer to a university hospital with a physical therapy ward, she finally started to cooperate. That university hospital was an hour and a half away from our house by car. I thought she'd complain about how it was unfilial of us not to visit as often as before, but surprisingly, she accepted it without much fuss. However, the physical therapist said that the muscles she'd lost while throwing tantrums were significant, and she'd have to be quite persistent to regain her strength. Internally, I was exhausted. After 3 months in the hospital, she was discharged. Even though she was discharged, she hadn't recovered enough to move her arms and legs freely like before. Rich and I talked about suggesting she move into an assisted living facility, but my mother-in-law insisted on living with us.
I absolutely don't want to go to a facility. Are you trying to abandon me?
She contacted everyone she knew, saying we were trying to get rid of her by putting her in a facility. We ended up being the bad guys. We got repeated calls from uncles and aunts saying that they feel sorry for my mother-in-law, or Rich is the eldest son, so he should take care of his mother. In the end, he agreed to live with her. It was just like my mother-in-law, knowing how much Rich cared about appearances. Rich did all sorts of things to keep my mother-in-law quiet, who complained all the time. He put in a ramp at the front door, bought a high-quality care bed. He welcomed her confidently, thinking there'd be nothing left for her to complain about, but then she said something unbelievable.
You're the wife, so you should take care of me completely.
My mother-in-law said I should be the one taking care of her entirely. I have a job, and there's no way I can provide full-time care. For her to live comfortably, we absolutely needed the help of a home care assistant. On top of that, we couldn't support her on Rich's income alone. I couldn't quit my job if we wanted to maintain our way of living. Rich openly explained this to my mother-in-law, but she remained stubborn.
I don't want some stranger taking care of me. What's wrong with asking the wife to do her duty?
She even threatened to tell all our relatives we were heartless if we didn't do as she said. The moment the word relatives was mentioned, Rich fell silent. In the end, I ended up having to work, raise my kids, and take care of her. To care for my mother-in-law, I quit the company where I had worked for a long time. I ended up working part-time at a local family diner. Because of this, my income dropped significantly, but since I reduced my work hours, I ended up spending a lot more time with my mother-in-law.
Hey, how long are you gonna make me wait? Bring me my food now.
When I'm at home, my mother-in-law is just so loud. If the meal preparation is even a little delayed, she yells loud enough for the whole house to hear and hurries me up. She also has very specific demands about meals. The tea must be piping hot. She wants a variety, sandwiches, pasta, pizza, etc. She insists on having 2 vegetable dishes with every meal. Meat and fish must be domestic products. Even though she can't move her legs well, her appetite is perfectly normal, which makes it a lot of work. Since she doesn't seem to have any other pleasures, she never compromises when it comes to meals. If the food is even slightly cold, she tells me to reheat it, and if the menu isn't to her liking, she outright demands that I remake it. As if preparing meals wasn't hard enough, taking care of her daily needs was no simple task either. She said she couldn't bathe by herself, so I had to assist her with everything. She doesn't want me to help with her bathroom needs, so whenever she has to go, she calls me no matter how busy I am, telling me to take her to the toilet. I also have to air out her room multiple times a day and clean it every day. The sheets and pillowcases must be changed daily too. There is no way her clothes and bedding even slightly wet. She says she can't sleep unless the sheets have been completely dry. When it rained continuously and the laundry became slightly moist, she complained endlessly. Honestly, there's nothing I can do about the weather. I almost said enough is enough more times than I can count. The biggest hassle was taking her to physical therapy once a week. She'd start complaining up a storm the day before. If I responded casually, she'd get in a bad mood and refuse to go to physical therapy. Throughout her physical therapy, and even after, all I encountered were complaints from her. Listening to that nonstop, my mental state was on the verge of collapse. I felt more and more cornered. Rich and I tried to talk to her many times about hiring a home helper, but her answer was always the same: no.
How could you not feel guilty about asking a stranger to take care of your own family?
With my mother-in-law making it sound like we were the villains, I continued working like a servant. However, 5 years after she'd been bedridden, her attitude suddenly changed.
I've decided to leave my care to a professional after all. Just make sure to cover the expenses.
Rich and I exchanged looks, wondering what had caused this sudden change in my previous stubborn mother-in-law. Nevertheless, the idea of gaining even a measure of independence from her care filled me with happiness. Suddenly motivated, my mother-in-law handled all the arrangements for the helper, and everything was decided quickly. The cost would be deducted monthly from her account, so I supplemented that by transferring the necessary amount each month. It will be costly, but with long-term care insurance and my return to full-time work, we should be able to afford it. The helper mainly came on weekdays, so there was little face-to-face interaction between us and them. My burden, both physically and mentally, decreased significantly, and I felt more at ease. Working outside also helped relieve my stress. The helper even took her to physical therapy, which was the hardest task of all, and for me, they were a true lifesaver. All I had to do was deposit money into my mother-in-law's account every month. However, on the 10th year of her being bedridden, a certain doubt started to arise within me. It had been several years since we hired the helper, but I had never once seen them. I didn't even know which agency they were from. I started to doubt whether the money was actually going to the helper. When I talked to Rich about it, he strongly agreed, nodding repeatedly. Although I was transferring the money to my mother-in-law's account every month, I hadn't checked if the expenses were being withdrawn. Rich tried to check her bank account, but she stubbornly refused, saying it was private.
You're just trying to steal money from my account,
She said, turning away, and we couldn't investigate further. We also thought about contacting the helper, but we didn't know their contact information. As our suspicions grew, Rich suggested something.
Let's find out if the helper is actually coming.
He brought home a small camera after work. That night, after making sure my mother-in-law was completely asleep, Rich and I set up cameras around different places in the house. Later on, the footage recorded by the camera was pretty shocking. A while after we left for work, my mother-in-law casually got out of bed. She stretched out, moved her neck and shoulders to loosen up, and then walked right out of her room. After a while, she came back with ice cream in her hand. Rich and I were speechless watching her plop down on the bed and eat ice cream. She walked all over the house and even got into the bath by herself. After that, she changed clothes, did her makeup, and I heard the front door open. She must have gone out. When she came back 30 minutes later, she was holding grocery bags from the store. They were full of snacks. She secretly hid them in the back of the closet so we wouldn't find them. It was almost comical. Apparently, she acted the same as before during the day when we weren't home, and as soon as we returned, she pretended to be incapable again.
What is this?
What is this? Rich and I muttered simultaneously. My mother-in-law's body had fully recovered. I was puzzled at how she could walk despite not taking physical therapy seriously, but regardless, she was walking. Seeing her in such good health on the screen, the anger I'd been holding in started to boil inside me. I couldn't stay quiet about this. We had to confront her. Rich felt the same way. That evening, Rich came home on time, and we decided to execute a plan together. We had bought her a TV to keep her entertained, and my mother-in-law watched the news on it every evening. That day as well, the news began to play loudly from her room. At that moment, we used a multifunction remote to control her TV. My mother-in-law was startled when the screen suddenly changed. The real show was about to begin. She seemed speechless seeing herself casually walking around the house. Our plan was to show her all the footage taken by the small cameras and make her admit everything. She tried to turn off the TV with her remote, but I used my multifunction remote to turn it back on immediately. She turned it off, I turned it back on. We went back and forth until she finally snapped and glared at me.
Hey, hand over that remote now.
Then why don't you come over here and get it yourself? You can walk, can't you?
I turned the TV back on, showing her walking around the house. The camera was high quality, so it even captured her cheerful humming clearly. The footage showed every part of her seemingly comfortable daily life. She persistently kept turning it off, but when Rich took her remote, she couldn't resist any longer.
You don't want to watch it so much? Why don't you walk over and turn off the main power yourself?
Rich glared at her intensely. With a pallid complexion, my mother-in-law carefully stood up, throwing a look in our direction to assess our reactions before she began to walk towards us slowly. She exaggeratedly dragged her feet, but at this point, it was just too obviously fake. Watching her with a cold stare, she quietly turned off the main power on the TV. The room fell silent. It seemed like she was trying to come up with some excuse, but nothing came to mind. Slowly, she sat down on the sofa and apologized to us.
I'm sorry.
It was the first time I'd ever seen my mother-in-law apologize like that. However, She only said that one word of apology loudly, and then started mumbling, seemingly trying to make excuses. When Rich said firmly to explain herself immediately, she started to explain, trembling. It turned out that from the time she started physical therapy, her legs were already strong enough, and after just a few days, she made an unbelievable recovery. Within a week, she was able to walk normally. However, if she fully recovered, she'd have to go back to living alone. If she continued pretending to be unable to move, she could stay with us. She thought she could live comfortably for the rest of her life this way, so she kept up the act. She refused physical therapy to make herself seem like a difficult person, reducing the number of follow-up visits to the hospital after discharge. I sighed at such shallow and selfish thinking. My mother-in-law said she just wanted to relax at home. At first, she enjoyed ordering me around, feeling superior, but eventually, she started finding my earnest caregiving bothersome. She lied about hiring a helper and used us to get spending money. She confessed that she spent most of that money on social games like online gambling games and puzzle games. What I transferred wasn't enough, so she also used her pension. She told the hospital doctors she was able to walk thanks to her physical therapy progress, and within a few days of telling us she wanted to hire a helper, she stopped physical therapy entirely. Since Rich and I were covering all her living expenses, she had no issue spending all her own money. For 10 years, without a care in the world, she had used me as she pleased while lounging around, and we just couldn't forgive her for that.
Get out now.
I nodded at Rich's words.
You can walk just fine, bathe by yourself, and even go shopping alone. You don't need caregiving. We're ending this cohabitation.
My mother-in-law, who had been looking down, suddenly raised her head and looked at us with teary eyes.
Please, just let me stay here.
Her family home had already been torn down, and the land sold. She said she couldn't possibly live alone then, making selfish excuses. Clearly seeking an easy life, both financially and physically, she continued to cling to us. Yet our determination remained unwavering.
You have 1 week to leave.
With that, Rich left my mother-in-law's room. I tried to follow him, but she grabbed my arm in a panic.
Please, wait. You'll still be on my side, right? Sure, we've had our differences, but that's just how it is between daughters-in-law and mothers-in-law. Let's get along from now on. I'll even help out around the house.
Did she still not realize that she was the cause of all the struggles and lack of harmony? I shook her hand off and spoke quietly.
Mom, you said before that you didn't want to rely on strangers. Well, I'm like a stranger despite being your daughter-in-law. Please stop treating me like family only when it's convenient for you.
My cold words made her slowly crumble. I walked away without looking back. After that, my mother-in-law made no move to prepare for her departure. Eventually, Rich lost patience and began packing for her. Seeing Rich packing her belongings into boxes with a fierce determination, she seemed unable to argue. My mother-in-law hastily rented a small apartment, but living on just her pension would surely be tough. She must have already wasted most of the money from selling the house on those ridiculous social games. Now that she couldn't rely on us, she seemed to be asking for help from others. Since we showed that hidden camera footage to several people, it looked like no one was willing to help her. Everyone was shocked by how she'd pretended to be disabled for 10 years. No one would answer her calls anymore. Rich demanded that she pay back the living expenses for those 10 years and the money that was supposed to go to the helper. She cried and tried to brush it off, saying she didn't have the money, but when Rich mentioned taking her to court, she went silent. Now, she works early mornings cleaning buildings and during the day at a factory to earn a living. After pretending to be disabled for years and freely using our time and money, My mother-in-law was surely suffering from her well-deserved payback. It was a pitiful end for someone who married for inheritance and deceived her stepson and his wife for an easy life. Rich and I had finally regained a peaceful daily life after 10 long years. Even if my mother-in-law really needed caregiving in the future, we would never offer her a helping hand. Though honestly, with her cunning nature, I bet she'll manage to stay strong and live a long life.